He showed up to that blind date looking like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. Because he hadn't. Stubble unshaved, jacket wrinkled, coffee stain on his collar that he noticed in the elevator and decided to ignore. Ethan Walker's plan was simple. Be so obviously uninterested that the woman across the table would make an excuse and leave within 20 minutes. Clean, painless, done. What he didn't plan for was her laughing at his terrible joke. What he didn't plan for was staying 3 hours past that first cup of coffee. And he definitely didn't plan for falling in love with a woman who was hiding a secret that would crack him open all over again. If this kind of story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the blind date, Ethan Walker burned his daughter's toast. Not because he was distracted, though he was. Not because he was a bad cook, though his range was limited. He burned it because he stood at the counter staring at the small refrigerator magnet his daughter Lily had made at school. A lumpy clay rectangle painted in mismatched colors with the word "Dada" spelled slightly crooked across the front, and he thought, for the 100th time that week, about how much he did not want to go tonight. "Daddy." Lily's voice came from the hall, accompanied by the irregular thump of a 5-year-old who had not yet mastered the art of putting on shoes while walking. "I smell burning." "I know." He turned back to the toaster and pressed the lever. The toast was dark brown on 3 sides and somehow pale on one corner. He dropped it on her plate anyway because Lily didn't care about toast quality. She cared about whether her strawberry jam was applied in a spiral pattern or a swirl pattern, and she would spend 90 seconds deliberating on this decision, regardless of how the toast looked underneath. She climbed into her chair at the kitchen table, a round table pressed against the window of their apartment on the 7th floor of a building in Astoria, Queens, and considered the toast with the gravity of a museum curator examining a questionable acquisition. "Spiral or swirl?" Ethan asked, already holding the jam. "Swirl," she said. "No, spiral." She pulled her knees up to her chest, thinking, "What's the difference again?" "Spiral starts in the middle and goes out. Swirl starts at the edge and comes in." "Spiral," she pointed at the toast, "because it's braver." He applied the jam in a spiral, sliding the plate toward her. She inspected it, nodded once in the manner of someone who expected nothing less, and began eating. Ethan poured his coffee and sat across from her. The morning light came in flat and gray through the window. October in New York, the sky the color of old dishwater, the trees along the street below going bare. From up here you could see the roof of the hardware store across the road, where someone had, years ago, spray-painted the word "patience" in block letters, and where the letters were now so faded they were almost invisible. Ethan had always found that funny in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Marcus called again," he said. Not to Lily, exactly, more to the air. "Uncle Marcus?" Lily looked up. "Is he coming over?" "Not today. He wants me to go somewhere tonight." "Where?" Ethan wrapped both hands around his mug. "Dinner." Lily considered this. "With a lady?" He looked at her. She was 5 years old and already possessed a quality of observation that occasionally alarmed him. "Why would you assume that?" "Because you made a face," she said. "You make that face when Marcus asks you to talk to ladies." He had not been aware he made a face. This was, he recognized, a problem. "Finish your toast." "You should go," she said, with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing at stake. "You need friends." "I have friends." "Marcus doesn't count because he's your best friend, and you already have him." She licked jam from her thumb. "My teacher says you need different kinds of friends." "Your teacher is very wise," Ethan said, and stood up to refill his coffee, and stood at the counter for a moment with his back to her, looking out the small window above the sink at the gray October sky. He was 32 years old, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He hadn't always been this way. There were photographs of Thier. He kept them in a drawer in the bedroom, not on display, but not thrown away either, because Lily might want them someday, of a version of Ethan Walker that was harder to recognize. A man who smiled easily, who stood with his arm around a woman named Rachel, both of them squinting into some summer sun on a beach in Cape Cod, both of them looking like people who believed the future was straightforward and manageable. Rachel had been his fiancée. They'd been together 4 years, engaged for 8 months. 2 weeks from their wedding when she told him she couldn't do it. That part, the ending of an engagement, the collapse of a relationship, was painful but survivable. These things happened. People changed. He understood that. What he didn't understand, couldn't fit inside any rational framework he tried to build, was the other thing. She had been sleeping with his business partner, David Crane, Ethan's partner at the small architecture firm they'd built together over 5 years, starting with nothing. 2 guys with drafting licenses and ambition and a shared office above a nail salon in Midtown that smelled constantly of acetone. The firm had been Ethan's design work and David's client relationships, and it had, against reasonable odds, started to succeed. Small commercial spaces, a couple of residential renovations, a community center project that had gotten them written up in an industry journal. And then Rachel told him. And David, when Ethan confronted him, didn't deny it. Sat behind his desk and looked at Ethan with something almost like relief, the look of a man who had been holding a lie for so long that discovery felt, at some level, like release. The firm dissolved. The relationship dissolved. Ethan kept the apartment they'd been renting. He couldn't afford it alone, but he made it work. And 6 weeks later, Rachel called to tell him she was pregnant. The pregnancy was not David's. The timing made that impossible. It was a moment of pure cruel comedy, the universe's idea of a joke, and Ethan spent approximately 48 hours in a state of shock before something settled in him. Some older, quieter part of him that he hadn't known was there. He wanted the child. Rachel did not want to raise it. She was moving to Portland, she said. She and David were trying to figure things out. She would sign whatever he needed to sign. And so Lily arrived into the world 7 months later, and Ethan Walker became a father in the same year he lost everything else. And he discovered that these two facts did not cancel each other out. They existed side by side, the devastation and the wonder, until gradually the wonder began to take up more space. He'd rebuilt carefully. Freelance architectural work, historic preservation mostly, because he'd always been drawn to old buildings, the way they accumulated stories in their bones. He'd developed a small reputation in that corner of the field. Enough work to pay the bills. Not enough to get ahead, but ahead of what exactly? He'd stopped thinking about ahead. Marcus Reeves had been his friend since college, and Marcus had watched this whole slow conversion from a person who wanted things to a person who'd decided wanting was dangerous. And he had, to his credit, mostly kept his opinions to himself. He called regularly. He came over for dinner. He and Lily had a complicated ongoing argument about which of the Ninja Turtles was the most competent, and Marcus maintained that Donatello was underrated with the intensity of someone defending a doctoral thesis. But occasionally Marcus pushed. The call had come Sunday evening, while Ethan was putting Lily to bed. "I need you to do something," Marcus had said, when Ethan called him back at 9 p.m. from the kitchen. Marcus Viltan. "Last time you needed me to do something, I ended up at a charity auction bidding on a wine tasting package I couldn't afford. You had fun at that auction. I spent 45 minutes trying to convince a hedge fund manager that exposed brick is a structural statement and not a design trend. You love talking about brick." Ethan poured a glass of water. "What is it, Marcus?" "Blind date." The silence that followed was long enough that Marcus filled it. "Her name is Victoria. She's a friend of Priya's from her MBA program. She's smart, she's funny. Priya says she's very real for someone in her position." "What position?" "She works in finance, some kind of executive thing. I don't know the details." A pause. "She's 30, she's single. She doesn't do this. Blind dates? But Priya somehow convinced her." "No." "Ethan, I'm not interested in—" "You're never interested in anything that isn't either Lily or a crumbling building, and I say that with complete love and also genuine concern. I'm fine. You had a social life that consisted of me, your daughter, and a podcast about architectural history. It's a very good podcast." "One dinner," Marcus said. "Thursday. You don't have to like her. You don't have to call her again. I'm just asking you to be a person who has dinner with another person." Ethan stared at the Dada magnet on the refrigerator. He thought about how easy it would be to say no. He thought about Lily telling him he needed different kinds of friends. He thought about the fact that he was 32 years old and the most interesting conversation he'd had in the past month was with a 90-year-old building inspector named Harold, who had opinions about the original plasterwork in a Harlem brownstone. "Fine," he said, "one dinner, but I'm not dressing up. Nobody's asking you to dress up. I'm going to be honest about what my life looks like. That's all anyone wants, Ethan. Honesty." He'd hung up and immediately felt the specific dread of a man who has agreed to something he cannot get out of. And then he'd gone back to his drafting table and spent 2 hours on a set of restoration plans for a bookstore on the Lower East Side, because that was the other thing about Ethan Walker. When he didn't want to think about something, he worked. But he arranged for Mrs. Petrov from next door to watch Lily on Thursday evening. Mrs. Petrov was 73, barely 5 feet tall, and had opinions about Lily's diet that she expressed with the directness of someone who had stopped caring what anyone thought sometime around 1987. She arrived at 6, took one look at Ethan in his going-out clothes, clean jeans, a dark blue shirt, his less terrible jacket, and said, "You look tired." "Thank you, Mrs. Petrov." "The jacket is wrinkled." "I know." "You should iron it." "I'm running late." She looked at him for a long moment, then, "Is it a woman?" "It's just dinner." "With a woman?" He picked up his keys. "Good night, Mrs. Petrov," she called after him as he went down the hall. "Don't be so grumpy. You have a nice face when you're not making that expression." He took the subway into Manhattan, standing in the car with one hand on the overhead bar, watching his own reflection in the dark window across from him. The jacket was wrinkled. He also had, he noticed, a small coffee stain on the collar that he had not noticed before leaving. He considered the effort required to address this and decided against it. By the time he walked into the restaurant, a place in the West Village, small and warm, dim lighting, the kind of place that tried to suggest intimacy without demanding it. He had been on the subway for 30 minutes and had spent most of it constructing his exit strategy. He would be polite. He would be honest about his situation. Single father, limited time, no interest in anything complicated. He would listen because he wasn't rude. He would make his position clear without being unkind, and then he would go home, and this would be over, and Marcus would have to stop asking for at least 6 months. He gave his name at the door and was shown to a table near the back. She wasn't there yet. He sat down, ordered water, and looked at the menu without reading it. Then he heard the door and looked up. The woman who came in was not what he'd expected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something more polished, maybe. Something that announced itself. She was wearing dark slacks and a simple cream-colored top, her dark hair pulled back but not perfectly, a few strands loose around her face. She walked without looking around for approval, just scanned the room briefly and then moved toward him when the host pointed, and her expression as she crossed the room was, and this was the thing he noticed first, not the expression of someone performing. It was the expression of someone who was also very slightly nervous. She saw the coffee stain on his collar immediately. He watched her see it, and she didn't do anything with that information except extend her hand and say, "Ethan, I'm Victoria. Sorry I'm a little late. The cab driver had an unusual theory about the best route to the West Village, and I made the mistake of engaging with it." He shook her hand. "What was the theory?" "That all one-way streets in Manhattan are secretly connected in a grid that only becomes visible after midnight." She sat down across from him. He was very committed to it. Was he right? I have no idea, but he made a compelling case. She looked at the menu. "Have you ordered?" "Just water." She flagged down the server with a small lift of her hand. Not imperious, just clear, and ordered sparkling water and asked what the soup of the day was. The server told her. She ordered it. And then she looked at Ethan with the direct attention of someone who was actually present for the conversation she was in. And she said, "Marcus tells me you do historic preservation. I didn't know that was a specialty." Ethan had been ready for a lot of opening moves. That was not one of them. "It is," he said. "Small field. Most people don't know it exists until a building they love is being demolished." "What made you interested in it?" He considered giving the short answer, the one he gave at parties, the 2-sentence version. Something about the intersection of history and function. Something tidy. Instead, because she was watching him with actual curiosity and not the polite performance of curiosity. He said, "There was a building near where I grew up, old theater, Art Deco, 1929, completely run down but still standing. I used to look at it on the way to school and think about everyone who'd been inside it. Like, the building had absorbed all of it, all those years, all those people. And then when I was in high school, they tore it down to put up a parking structure." He stopped. "Sorry, that's not a very interesting answer." "It's a very interesting answer," she said. "Most people want to hear about the technical side." "I'm not most people," she said, without self-consciousness, just stating a fact. "What happened after they tore it down?" He looked at her. "I spent 6 months angry about it and then went to architecture school." She smiled, not a polished smile, more like a smile that arrived before she decided to let it. "So the city accidentally created a preservationist by being careless with its history. That's one way to describe it." "What's your way?" He picked up his water glass. "I learned that most things that get lost didn't have to be." That landed somewhere between them, and she was quiet for a moment, and then the server came with her water and they looked at menus and the conversation found other ground. She asked about the current project he was working on, and he told her about the bookstore on the Lower East Side, built in 1901, pressed tin ceilings, original hardwood floors that had been covered over with cheap laminate in the 1970s and were miraculously intact underneath. "Like finding buried treasure," she said. "Exactly like that, except the treasure is a floor, and you still have to figure out how to pay for the finishing." She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, and then asked a question about structural assessment that was specific enough that he looked at her differently for a second. "You know something about construction," he said. "I know a little about a lot of things," she said. "Occupational habit." He wanted to ask what that meant, but the food came and they moved on, and later he would think about that sentence. "I know a little about a lot of things," and noticed that she had, in that moment, told him nothing about what she actually did. The thing that he hadn't planned for was how easy it was. Not effortless. There were pauses, moments where they reached for what to say next, which is the natural rhythm of two strangers talking. But it wasn't the performance he'd braced for. She didn't ask him the screening questions he'd gotten used to from the handful of attempts Marcus had dragged him into over the past year. "What are you looking for? Are you close with your family? Do you see yourself wanting more kids?" Questions that were, in their own way, auditions. She asked him what he was currently reading. He told her, a book about the restoration of Grand Central Terminal, which she had apparently also read, or at least started. They argued mildly about a particular chapter. She was wrong about one specific point, and he told her so, and she looked slightly startled and then said, "Okay, yes, I think you're right," with the ease of someone who didn't need to win. He'd expected to be halfway home by now. The waiter came and asked if they wanted dessert, and Victoria said she was going to say no, but the creme brulee looked unreasonable, and could they split it? Ethan said fine. They split it. Victoria did the thing where you tap the caramelized top with the back of a spoon to crack it, and she did it incorrectly on the first attempt and made a face. "You're supposed to hit it more confidently," he said. "I know how creme brulee works." "Then why—" "I was being polite." She handed him the spoon. "You do it." He cracked the top cleanly. She pointed at him. "That was luck." "Absolutely," he agreed. They stayed another 40 minutes after the creme brulee. He told her about Lily without planning to. It came out sideways, in the middle of a conversation about city parks, because he mentioned taking Lily to a playground in Astoria on weekends, and then felt the familiar brace of a man who had learned that mentioning a child on a first date often changed the temperature of a room. People became careful, or they pivoted to a performance of enthusiasm that was somehow worse. Victoria said, "How old is she?" 5. "What's she interested in?" "Not that must be hard, or you're raising her alone, that's so admirable," or any of the words that were meant to be kind and always felt like a hand on his shoulder he hadn't asked for. Just, what is she interested in? "She's currently convinced that one of the pigeons in the park has been following us," he said. "She's named it Sergeant Pesto." "Why Pesto?" "I genuinely don't know. I've asked. She says it's obvious." Victoria considered this. Maybe it is obvious and we're the ones who don't get it. That's what she says. She sounds correct. He looked at his coffee. He'd ordered coffee at some point without noticing. and thought, not for the first time that evening, that this was not how tonight was supposed to go. Outside, the night had gone properly cold, the West Village quiet in the way it got on weeknights when the weekend energy drained away, and the streets settled into themselves. They stood on the sidewalk and the goodbye moment arrived, that uncertain beat where an evening has to decide what it is. "I didn't expect to stay this long," Ethan said. "Neither did I." She pulled her coat a little tighter. "That's usually a good sign. Or we're both bad at goodbyes." "That too." She looked at him with that direct attention that he'd noticed at the beginning of the evening, and that had not modulated over the past 3 hours. "Can I say something honest?" "Sure." "Marcus told me a little about your situation, not details. Just that you'd been through some things and you weren't really looking." She paused. "I'm also not really looking. I'm also in a place where getting involved in anything feels like a project I don't have time for." She glanced down the street, then back at him. "But I had a really good time tonight, and I think it would be strange to pretend I didn't." He was quiet for a second. "I had a good time too." "Okay." She nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Then maybe coffee sometime. No agenda, no pressure, just—" She gestured vaguely. "Two people who aren't looking, drinking coffee." He looked at her. She was not performing. She was not maneuvering. She was standing on a sidewalk in October saying an honest thing. "Coffee," he said. "Yeah, okay." She smiled. Again that unguarded version, the one that arrived before it was invited, and said goodnight, and walked to the corner to hail a cab. He watched her for a second before starting toward the subway. A cab pulled up almost immediately, because that was how the city sometimes worked, giving things easily and without ceremony. On the subway back to Queens, he stood in the car again, hand on the overhead bar, watching his reflection in the window. The jacket was still wrinkled, the coffee stain was still there. He looked, honestly, like a man who had not tried at all. He thought about the way she'd said, "I know a little about a lot of things." He thought about the question she'd asked, what's she interested in, without the performance of asking it. He thought about the creme brulee, the incorrect first tap, the face she'd made. He got off at his stop and walked the 3 blocks to his building and took the elevator to the 7th floor and quietly let himself in. Mrs. Petrov had fallen asleep in the armchair with the television on low, the way she always did when she watched Lily. Lily was in her room, in bed, in the manner of someone who had theoretically been asleep for 90 minutes, but was actually, as Ethan would discover in the morning, 80% awake and listening. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark, coat still on. The Dada magnet caught a stripe of light from the street lamp through the window. The refrigerator hummed. The city made its low, constant noise outside. He had not expected tonight to feel like anything. He was annoyed, in some quiet, reluctant way, that it had. He texted Marcus at 10:30 from the couch. She was fine. Marcus's reply came in 40 seconds. Fine as in fine, or fine as in, "You're being difficult." Ethan stared at the ceiling. She asked what Lily was interested in. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "I'm going to need more from you than that." He thought about the Art Deco theater, the parking structure, the way he'd told that story to someone for the first time in years, and she had listened not like someone waiting for him to stop, but like someone following. She made a solid argument about the Grand Central restoration, he typed. She was wrong about Chapter 7, but she admitted it. Marcus. "Oh no." Ethan. "What?" Marcus. "Nothing." "Good night, Ethan." He put his phone on the coffee table and looked at the ceiling for a while. Through the walls he could hear the faint sound of Lily breathing, the particular slow rhythm of a child actually asleep, not performing it. The city outside was doing its usual thing. Somewhere on the street below a car alarm went off and then stopped. Someone laughed on the sidewalk, brief and bright. Ethan closed his eyes. He had one project to finish, a bookstore to save, a 5-year-old who believed a pigeon was following them and had named it Sergeant Pesto. A life that was small and manageable and accounted for, with no surprises in it, which was what he had decided he wanted. He told himself that clearly, in the quiet of his apartment, to the ceiling. Then he lay there for a while, not sleeping, thinking about nothing in particular. 3 days later, he texted her. There's a coffee place near the bookstore I'm restoring. Best pressed tin ceiling you've ever seen if you're standing in the right spot. Interested? She replied in 11 minutes. When? He looked at his phone. He thought about saying he needed to check his schedule. He thought about not seeming too available. He thought about all the sensible, careful things a person with his particular history should do. Saturday morning, he typed. 9 o'clock. I'll be there, she said. He set his phone down and picked up his drafting pencil and went back to the bookstore plans, because that was what he did with information he wasn't ready to process. He put it somewhere and kept moving. The pencil moved across the paper. The building, slowly, took shape. Outside, October continued to disassemble itself, leaf by leaf. The city going spare and skeletal and honest, the way it always did before winter came and changed the rules of everything. The coffee shop was called Foundry, and it sat on a narrow stretch of Delancey Street between a laundromat and a bike repair shop that appeared to operate exclusively on the honor system. Bicycles leaned against the outside wall with handwritten price tags, a tin can bolted to the door for payments, and nobody visible inside. Ethan had been coming to Foundry for 4 months, ever since the bookstore project began, and he still wasn't sure if the bike shop was a functioning business or an elaborate art installation. He arrived at Foundry at 8:52 with a rolled-up set of floor plans under his arm because he'd been at the bookstore since 7 and had not thought to drop them off first. He ordered his usual, black coffee, no adjustments, and sat at the table near the window that had the best sightline to the pressed tin ceiling, which ran the full length of the space in a repeating fleur-de-lis pattern, original to the building's 1908 construction and somehow never painted over. It had been painted around inexplicably, which meant a century of coats had accumulated on the walls while the ceiling stayed clean. Ethan had spent 20 minutes the first time he came here standing on a chair to get a closer look, while the owner watched him with patient confusion. At 9:01, Victoria walked in. She was wearing a dark green coat he hadn't seen before and carrying nothing except her phone and her keys, which she dropped into her coat pocket as she came through the door. She looked around the room once, taking it in, not searching for him, he could see the difference. And then her eyes found the ceiling. She stopped. She stood just inside the door of a coffee shop on a Saturday morning and looked up at an old pressed tin ceiling for a full 10 seconds, while the person behind her had to step around her, and her expression was the expression of someone encountering something they hadn't expected to like, and liking it anyway. Then she saw him watching her and walked over. "You were right," she said, sitting down. "That's worth it." "It's original," he said. "Never touched." She looked up again briefly. "How is that possible?" "I don't know. Sometimes things survive just because nobody thought to ruin them." He gestured at the menu on the table. "Coffee?" "Yes, whatever's good here." He waved at the counter. He knew the owner well enough to get a nod in return. Victoria settled across from him and noticed the rolled-up plans and said, "Is that the bookstore?" "I came from there this morning. I was going to leave them at the site and forgot." "Can I see?" He looked at her for a second. People asked to see his drawings sometimes in the way they asked to see vacation photos, as a social gesture, not a genuine request. He couldn't tell, with her, which it was. So he spread one of the plans out across the table and pointed to the relevant areas. The floor showing the laminate removal and original hardwood underneath, the proposed restoration of the front facade, the staircase that had been partially demolished in the 80s and that he was trying to rebuild with period-accurate materials. She looked at it for longer than he expected. She asked where the structural concerns were. She asked about the original material sourcing. At one point, she put her finger on a section of the drawing and said, "What happens here if the subfloor underneath is compromised?" "Then we have a conversation about money," he said. "And usually the client decides they can live with certain compromises." "Does that bother you?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes, every time." She looked at him. "But you do it anyway." "It's better than not doing it at all." The coffee came. She wrapped her hands around the mug. It was a heavy ceramic thing, dark blue, the kind of mug that held heat, and said, "That's an interesting way to work. Most people in high-stakes fields decide early on whether they can live with compromise or whether it ruins everything for them." "Which category are you in?" She was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding the question, she seemed to actually think about it. I'm not sure, she said. I've spent a long time believing that if I could control enough variables, compromise would be optional. How's that working out? She smiled into her mug. Ongoing experiment. He didn't press. She didn't elaborate. They moved on, the way conversations do when they hit something real, and both people decide, without saying so, to come back to it later. They stayed until 10:30. When they walked out, she stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the building's facade. A narrow 3-story commercial building in need of repointing, original cornice still intact, and said, "You see everything differently, don't you? I just walk past buildings." "You stopped inside for a full 10 seconds when you came in," he said. "I didn't know you were watching." "You stopped in front of the door. I was hard to miss." She looked at him. "Most people don't notice what other people actually do." "Occupational habit," he said, and watched something register in her expression. She recognized the phrase, because it was the one she'd used the week before. "I know a little about a lot of things. Occupational habit." And she gave him a look that was caught between caught and amused. "Touché," she said. They walked to the corner and parted ways. No plans made, no agenda established. Just a Saturday morning that had run an hour and a half and left Ethan Walker standing on Delancey Street with his floor plans under his arm, watching her walk toward the subway entrance, thinking that she moved through the city the way people did when they'd been navigating it a long time, efficiently, without fuss, and that there was something he still didn't quite have a handle on. He wanted to know what she did, not out of any practical concern, just because the careful way she didn't say it had started to take up space. The weeks that followed had their own momentum. It wasn't planned. Nothing about it was planned, which was, he recognized, precisely the quality that made it hard to guard against. There was no escalation he could point to, no clear moment where the frequency shifted. It just did, the way weather shifts, incrementally and then all at once. Text messages that started as short and functional grew longer without either of them commenting on it. They had coffee again the following Saturday, and the one after that. She showed up one Thursday evening when he was working late at the bookstore site, having texted to ask if he was still there, and she brought 2 containers of soup from a place 2 blocks away because it was 40 degrees outside, and she said she'd passed it on the way, and it smelled significant. They sat on upturned crates in the unfinished space, with soup and plastic spoons, while Ethan explained what was happening structurally to the front wall, and Victoria asked questions that were sharper than he expected, and at some point he realized he had been talking for 40 minutes, and she had not once checked her phone. That was the thing about her. She did not check her phone when he was talking. He had been on enough dates, had enough conversations in the past few years to know that this was not universal. She met Lily by accident. It was a Sunday, early November, one of those clear, cold days that felt less like fall and more like winter announcing its intentions. He'd taken Lily to the park, the one in Astoria, with the good climbing structure and the sycamore trees that Lily had developed complicated feelings about. And he'd texted Victoria something minor about a book she'd mentioned, and she'd replied asking if she was interrupting his weekend, and he'd said no, they were at the park, and she'd said she was actually nearby, which surprised him. And then she said if it was okay, she could come say hello, and he'd looked at Lily attempting to befriend a squirrel and said, "Sure, okay." Victoria arrived 20 minutes later in jeans and a gray sweater, less put together than he'd seen her, hair not quite as controlled, and she sat on the bench beside him and watched Lily, who was now crouched approximately 4 feet from the squirrel with a piece of pretzel extended in her palm, barely breathing. "Has she caught one yet?" Victoria asked quietly, so as not to interrupt the operation. In her mind, she catches one every time. The squirrel's definition of caught may differ. They watched. The squirrel took a step forward, considered the pretzel, thought better of it, and retreated. Lily did not move. "She has incredible patience," Victoria said. "She did not get that from me." "Where did she get it?" He thought about it. "I don't know. She just arrived like that." Lily eventually noticed the new person on the bench and came over with the remaining half of her pretzel, which she offered to Victoria without preamble. Victoria took a small piece. Lily approved of this and sat between them on the bench and said, "Do you know about the pigeons?" Victoria looked at Ethan. He shook his head very slightly. "Tell me about the pigeons," Victoria said. "There's one that follows us," Lily said. His name is Sergeant Pesto. He's been following us since September. How do you know it's the same one? Lily looked at her with mild patience. He has a spot, right here. She pointed to her own chest. A dark spot. I know which one he is. Victoria nodded slowly. That's good field work. Lily considered her. What do you do? I work with money, Victoria said. Buildings, mostly, and other things. Like what Daddy does? Sort of. He makes them better. I help pay for that. She said it simply, without elaboration, and Lily seemed satisfied and moved on to explaining the squirrel situation, which apparently had geopolitical dimensions Ethan had not been aware of. Walking home an hour later, Lily between them on the sidewalk, Ethan watched Victoria listen to a detailed account of Lily's class rabbit, whose name was Broccoli, and who was, in Lily's assessment, handling the responsibility of being the class pet with questionable commitment. He sleeps too much, Lily said seriously. Maybe he's thinking, Victoria said. Rabbits don't think. How do you know? Lily paused, clearly not having considered this. They have small heads. So does a lot of brilliant software. Lily's brow furrowed with the effort of working out whether this was a joke. Ethan pressed his lips together and said nothing. At the corner of their block, Victoria crouched to say goodbye to Lily at eye level, which, Ethan noticed, she did naturally without making it a performance. Lily gave her a brief, evaluating look and said, You can come to the park again. I'd like that, Victoria said. Lily accepted this and walked ahead toward their building, already narrating something to herself under her breath. Ethan and Victoria stood on the corner. She's extraordinary, Victoria said. He looked at his daughter, now waiting impatiently at the building door. She has her moments. She offered me her pretzel. That's trust. She offers food to anyone she likes. It's the highest form of approval in her system. Victoria smiled. And then she said, You've built something really good, Ethan. And before he could figure out what to do with that. She had said goodbye and was walking back toward the subway, and Lily was shouting from the doorway that the elevator button didn't work if you didn't push it hard enough, which was not true, but was Lily's consistent position on the matter. He started paying closer attention after that. Not in a suspicious way, just watching. She never talked about work in specific terms. When it came up, and it did come up, she managed to speak around it with a fluency that he might not have noticed if he weren't, by professional training, someone who looked at the bones of things. She used words like firm and sector and portfolio without attaching them to anything concrete. When he asked once what her company was called, she said something that he didn't quite catch because a truck went by at exactly the wrong moment, and she moved on before he could ask her to repeat it. He told himself it wasn't important. People were private. He was private. He didn't volunteer information about himself, and he didn't expect it from anyone else. But the thing about watching is that once you start, you can't stop the information from coming in. She paid for everything easily and without looking at the check. Not in a showy way. Actually, the opposite. She paid quickly and efficiently, like someone who had learned that making a production of it wasted more time than it saved. When they went to a restaurant in the West Village one Friday evening, nicer than their usual spots, he'd suggested it mostly because he'd always wanted to try it and had never had an occasion. She looked at the menu without flinching at the prices and ordered the way people did when they had not thought about the price. He noticed this and told himself it meant nothing. People earned well. Finance was well compensating. None of it was his business. There was an event she mentioned, briefly, the kind of mention you make when something slips out before you can catch it. A benefit dinner, an organization she apparently supported. She said she had to leave early next Saturday because of it and then moved immediately to something else, and he let it go, but he filed it. And there was the phone. Not that she was always on it. She wasn't. But when it rang and she silenced it, he had started to notice the small change that happened in her expression. Something that looked like management, like someone putting something in a box for later. The phone rang more than he would have expected for someone who described herself vaguely as working in finance. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what he would say. And in the absence of language for whatever concern he had, he kept showing up, and she kept showing up, and somewhere in the space of those November weeks something shifted between them that neither of them named. Marcus noticed before Ethan was ready to admit anything. They had dinner at Marcus's apartment on a Tuesday. Marcus cooked, which he did badly and confidently, a combination that Ethan had always found more charming than it deserved to be. And at some point, Marcus said, "You're different." "Different how?" "Lighter. You used to come here and talk about architectural specifications for 40 minutes before remembering that social conversation exists." "I talked about Victoria," Ethan said, then regretted it. Marcus set down his fork. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting for a sentence like that for several years and was taking a moment to appreciate its arrival. "You talked about her," Marcus said. "I mentioned her." "You said her name voluntarily without me asking." Ethan picked up his fork. "Let's not." "Ethan, I said let's not." Marcus let it alone for approximately 90 seconds. Then, "She's a good person. Priya thinks the world of her." "I know. She doesn't do this either. Date around, I mean. According to Priya, she's been—" He paused, choosing words. "Pretty locked up for a long time. Work. Only work." "What does she do?" Ethan asked. He said it like it was incidental, like it was the natural next question and not the one he'd been not asking for 5 weeks. Marcus was quiet for a beat too long. Ethan looked at him. "Marcus, she should tell you that herself." "That's not a nothing answer." "No," Marcus said. "It's not." He picked up his fork again. "Just ask her, Ethan. Have that conversation. Don't Google her." It was a strange thing to say. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Marcus met his eyes, then looked back at his plate, and they ate in a silence that had something uncomfortable moving through it. He didn't Google her that night. He came home, paid Mrs. Petrov, checked on Lily, made himself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table with his drafting pencil and the bookstore plans. The project was at a complicated phase. The subfloor had turned out to be partially compromised in the northeast corner, as he'd feared, and the conversation about money had happened, and the client had agreed to certain compromises, and every one of those compromises sat in Ethan's chest like a small stone. He worked until midnight. He did not Google her. He asked her directly on a Wednesday evening in late November, which in retrospect was possibly not the ideal setting. They were walking through the Lower East Side after dinner. It had started raining lightly without warning. They were both slightly damp, and she had his jacket over her head in the improvisational way you did when you hadn't brought an umbrella. But the question had been building for long enough that it came out when there was a gap in the conversation big enough to hold it. "I want to ask you something." "Okay?" She adjusted the jacket over her head. The rain was cold and intermittent, the kind that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "What do you actually do?" She was quiet. "I know you work in finance," he said. "I know it involves investment and buildings and other things. I know you have a phone that rings constantly and that you talk about your work the way someone talks around something they don't want to touch." He wasn't accusatory. He was just saying it straight, the way he always eventually said things when he got tired of carrying them sideways. "I'm not asking for a biography. I'm asking because I've been trying to figure it out for 5 weeks, and I think you've been careful." She lowered the jacket. She was getting wet now, her hair catching the rain. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not guarded, exactly, but like someone standing at the edge of a decision. "I am careful," she said. "Why?" She looked down the street. A cab went by too fast, spraying water from the gutter. She didn't flinch. "Because I have been in situations where the information changes things," she said finally. "Where I tell someone what I do, and the conversation stops being a conversation and becomes something else." He thought about that. "What does it become?" "Careful," she said, "or calculating. People either start handling me differently or they start, I don't know, wanting something." She looked at him. The rain was coming harder now. "You're the first person in a long time who's talked to me like a person and not like a context." He thought about the restaurant in the West Village, the menu, the prices she hadn't noticed. He thought about the benefit dinner she'd mentioned and moved past. He thought about Marcus's face when he'd asked the question, "Don't Google her." "Victoria," he said, "what do you do?" She looked at him, wet and not pretending otherwise, on a sidewalk in the rain with his jacket in her hands, and she said, "I run a firm. Investment. It's a—" She stopped. It's large. The firm is larger than I usually say. How large? She held his gaze. Large enough that it changes the temperature of a room when it comes up. He didn't say anything. He waited. She didn't finish. A cab materialized at the corner as they always did, available and immediate, and she raised her hand and it pulled up and she gave him back his jacket. I'll tell you properly, she said. When we're not standing in the rain, can we... She stopped. I'm sorry, I know that's not... Yeah, he said. Okay. She got in the cab. He stood there for a second in the rain, jacket in hand, watching the cab's taillights disappear around the corner. He walked to the subway. He sat in the car on the way back to Queens, damp and thinking, with the familiar feeling of a building whose plans he had been working from for weeks, revealing, very quietly, a wall that wasn't on any of the drawings. That night, alone in his kitchen with his tea cold in the mug and Lily asleep down the hall, he opened his laptop. He sat there for 60 seconds. Then he typed her name into the search bar. The first result loaded. He read the headline. He read the next one. He read the third. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen, at the water stain in the corner from last winter's upstairs leak that he'd never gotten around to reporting, and he understood what Marcus had meant and why Marcus had said it, and he understood with the specific clarity of a person who has been here before. Not the same room, not the same situation, but the same essential architecture of being shown at the wrong moment that the ground was different than you thought, that this was about to require something from him he wasn't sure he had. He didn't cancel their plans that weekend. He almost did. He stood in his kitchen Saturday morning with his phone in his hand and Lily eating cereal at the table and drafted 2 different texts, one polite and one less polite, and deleted both. Because the other thing he was, under everything, was fair. And fairness required that he hear it from her. She had said, "When we're not standing in the rain." He arrived at the restaurant on time. She was already there. She had gotten to places first consistently, which was one of those small things he'd cataloged without meaning to, and she was sitting with a glass of water, and he could see from across the room as the host led him to the table, nervous. Not performing nervousness. Actually nervous. There was a tension in her shoulders that wasn't usually there, and she was turning the water glass in small rotations on the table, the gesture of someone who needed something to do with their hands. He sat down. She looked at him. He looked at her, and something passed between them in that look. He wasn't sure what to call it, except honest. Both of them in the same place, knowing what the conversation was. "I looked you up," he said. She stopped turning the glass. "I know I said I'd wait," he said, "but I went home, and I sat there, and—" He stopped, because he was not going to say, "I couldn't stand not knowing," because that wasn't entirely accurate. What he couldn't stand was not understanding what he was dealing with. What he couldn't stand was the feeling of a structure that didn't match its drawings. "I Googled you." "Okay," she said. "Victoria Hayes." He said her name. CEO of Hayes Capital Group, one of the 10 largest private investment firms in the United States. He paused. Estimated net worth? The article I read said $8 billion, but the next one said 12. And I don't know which one is accurate, and I'm not sure it matters because the number is... He stopped again. "Large," she said quietly. "Yeah." She looked at her water glass. "I was going to tell you tonight." "I know." "I was going to, She exhaled. "I had this whole approach figured out. I was going to explain why I hadn't said anything and what it meant, and..." She looked up. "It sounds ridiculous when I describe it out loud." "Why didn't you just tell me on the first date?" "Because..." She stopped. Tried again. "Because the last person I told on a first date spent the rest of the evening treating me like an opportunity. Not badly. He was perfectly nice. He just rearranged, and I could see him rearranging, and the conversation became about what I could do and what I could offer, and..." She looked at him. "I know that's not you. I know that now. I didn't know that then." He thought about the first date, the coffee stain, the argument about the Grand Central chapter, the creme brulee. "And after the first date?" he said. She held his gaze. "After the first date, I didn't want to disrupt it." That's not a good enough reason, Victoria." "No," she said. It's not. She said it simply, without deflection. I kept thinking, one more week, when we know each other better, when there's enough of something built that this doesn't change it. She put her hands flat on the table. And the longer I waited, the worse it got. I know that. He looked at her. He looked at the woman who had listened to him talk about an Art Deco theater being demolished in his hometown, who had asked, what is she interested in, without making it a gesture, who had sat on a bench in Astoria Park and eaten a piece of his daughter's pretzel and crouched down to say goodbye at eye level, naturally, without thinking about it. He looked at her, and he thought about trust, about what it cost and what it was worth, and what it meant that he'd been sitting here for 7 weeks, and this was the thing he'd been afraid of finding. Not the money, not the power or the size of the firm or the number on whatever Forbes list she appeared on. The hiding. Because he had been hidden from before. He had sat across from people and believed what they showed him, and discovered afterward that there had been a whole other architecture behind the wall. And the thing that happened when you found that, even when the hiding was understandable, even when the reasons made sense, was that you started looking at all the walls again. I need to think, he said. Victoria nodded. She wasn't going to argue with that. That was the other thing. She didn't maneuver. She didn't reach across the table or soften her expression into something more strategic. He got up. He put on his jacket. He put enough on the table to cover the drinks. Ethan, she said it quietly, not to stop him, just to say his name. He looked at her. The parts you know are real, she said. All of it. He left. Outside the restaurant, the city moved around him as it always did, indifferent and immense, and he walked for a while without direction, hands in his pockets, through streets that were getting cold and dark, and full of the particular Saturday night energy of people who knew where they were going. He walked for 6 blocks before he took out his phone. Not to call anyone, just to hold it. He thought about what she'd said. The parts you know are real. He thought about the fact that he'd known. Somewhere under the reasoning, he'd known for weeks that there was something larger behind the careful language. He'd known, and he'd kept going. That was the thing he couldn't sort out, whether that meant he trusted her on some level he hadn't acknowledged, or whether it meant that he'd been doing, very quietly, the same thing she'd been doing, choosing not to look directly at something he wasn't ready to deal with. He stood at a corner he didn't recognize, and the lights changed and people crossed and nobody looked at him, which was the great mercy of the city when you needed it. He turned and started walking toward the subway. He didn't know what he was going to do. He knew he wasn't going to call Marcus, because Marcus would say, I told you to ask her, and he wasn't in the mood to be right about. He knew he was going home to his apartment and his daughter and the bookstore plans that still had the compromised subfloor to deal with. He knew he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. And he knew, he couldn't unknow this, which was the problem, that nothing she had shown him had been false. That was the part he kept coming back to, on the subway, on the walk home from the station, standing outside his building in the cold for a moment before going in. She had hidden what she had. She had not invented what she was. He didn't know yet if that distinction was enough, but it was the last thought he had before he let himself into the apartment and hung up his jacket and went to check on Lily, who was asleep with her arm thrown over the edge of the bed in the way she had, completely committed to it, all the way to the edge of everything and not afraid. He gave it a week, not because he had a plan, not because he'd calculated that 7 days was the appropriate amount of distance. He gave it a week because that was how long it took before the silence started costing more than the conversation. And even then, he wasn't sure he was ready. He was just less sure about not being ready. During that week, he worked. He was good at that. He went to the bookstore site every morning and spent his hours solving problems that had dimensions and weight and cost estimates, problems that existed in the physical world and responded to physical solutions. The compromised subfloor in the northeast corner had been opened up and was worse than he'd thought. Not catastrophically, but enough that he spent 2 days reworking the plans and 3 phone calls managing the client's reaction, which progressed through stages of alarm, resentment, and grudging acceptance in roughly the same sequence every client went through when reality diverged from budget. He picked up Lily from school. He made dinner. He let her beat him at the memory card game 3 nights in a row, though on the 4th night, he started actually paying attention and won decisively. And Lily stared at the table for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a worldview, and then said, You were letting me win before. And Ethan said, yes. And she thought about that and said, okay, good to know, and shuffled the cards for another round. Marcus called on Thursday. Ethan let it go to voicemail. Marcus texted 20 minutes later. You don't have to talk about it, but you should eat actual food. Ethan replied, I'm eating. Marcus, work doesn't count as eating. Ethan put his phone face down on the drafting table and went back to his plans. He did not call Victoria. She did not call him either. She texted once, on Monday. A single line, no pressure attached. Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. He read it. He didn't reply. He set the phone down and picked up his pencil and sat there for a moment, and then drew a very precise line on the paper that had nothing to do with how he felt, because precise lines were something he could control. The thing he couldn't stop doing was thinking about the distinction she'd made. The parts you know are real. He turned it over like a stone, examining each face, because there was something true in it and something that wasn't enough, and he couldn't cleanly separate the two. What he knew was real. The way she listened. The questions she asked that were too specific to be performance. The park bench and Lily's pretzel, and the way she'd crouched down without thinking about it. 3 hours in that restaurant on the night they met, neither of them planning to stay. The pressed tin ceiling and the fact that she'd stopped just inside the door to look at it before she even found him. What he didn't know, how much of the last 7 weeks had been, on her side, a kind of test, a controlled environment, a situation she could manage. Because the thing about people who ran multi-billion-dollar enterprises was that they were, by professional necessity, very good at managing situations, at knowing what information to release and when and how. He knew he was being unfair when he thought about it that way. He knew it even as he thought it. He thought it anyway because that was what fear did. It found the most uncharitable interpretation and kept handing it back to you. On Friday evening, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold and looked at the data magnet on the refrigerator and thought about Rachel. Not with bitterness. The bitterness had gone years ago, replaced by something that was just tiredness, the residue of a thing that had cost a lot. He thought about the specific experience of believing you knew the shape of something and then finding out the shape was different. The way that experience left a residue that didn't wash off cleanly. He had not let anyone close enough to matter since then. He had been careful about it. He had structured his life around its absence. And then he had sat across a restaurant table from a woman who had a coffee stain on his collar and an argument about architectural history and a 5-year-old who named pigeons after condiments, and he had, without fully consenting to it, let her matter. That was what was sitting in the middle of his chest. Not the money, not the scale of her company or the number on a Forbes list. The fact that she mattered. The fact that it had happened without his permission, and now there was this, and the thing about having let someone matter was that the damage was already done whether you stayed or not. He called her on Saturday morning. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting, or she always answered fast. Or both. Hi, she said. Hi. He was standing at the kitchen window. Lily was at a birthday party, the daughter of one of the other parents at her school, which meant Ethan had 2 hours and 30 minutes of unstructured time, a rarity that he usually used for work. He had spent the last 40 minutes failing to work. I want to talk. Okay? Not on the phone. A pause. Where? He thought about the coffee shop with the pressed tin ceiling. He thought about the restaurant where they'd had their last conversation, the water glass she'd been turning in circles. He thought about the bookstore site, which was empty on weekends, which was his space in a way no restaurant or coffee shop was. The bookstore, he said. If you don't mind a construction site. I'll wear appropriate shoes, she said. He almost said something else. He let it go. 11? I'll be there. She was. He was still unlocking the front door when he heard her footsteps on the sidewalk behind him, and he held the door open without turning around, and she came in and stood in the space the way she had the first time he'd described it to her, looking up, taking it in. The pressed tin ceiling here was half restored, the cleaned sections gleaming against the uncleaned, the difference stark and beautiful in the way that restoration work always was before it was finished. The original hardwood floors were partially exposed in the main room, the laminate torn back to the south wall, The front window, original glass, slightly wavy in the way old glass was, let in the flat December light. The place smelled like plaster dust and old wood and the particular cold construction smell that Ethan associated with every project he'd ever loved. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's a mess," he said, though he knew what she meant. Both things. She looked at the ceiling, then at the floors, then at him. She was wearing a dark coat, practical boots. She looked like herself, not managed, just herself. He had brought 2 coffees from the place on the corner. He handed her one and sat on the wide windowsill, and she sat on a sawhorse 4 feet away, and they were quiet for a moment, which was something they'd learned they could do. Sit in silence without it meaning failure. "I want to understand something," he said, "and I need you to be honest." "Yes." "Not the hiding part. I understand the hiding part. I don't agree with how long it went on, but I understand why." He looked at his coffee. "What I want to understand is, did you know who I was before the blind date? Did someone vet me? Did Marcus and Priya set this up with information flowing in one direction?" She looked at him steadily. "No, because Priya is your friend, and she knew the setup, and Priya told me your name, and that you were Marcus's best friend, and that you'd been through some hard things, and that you were a good person. That's what I knew." She paused. "I told her not to tell me more because I didn't want to come in with a picture. I find that it makes me perform instead of just being there." He held her gaze. He was looking for the management in it, the strategic placement of information. He was looking for the qualities she'd said other people acquired when they knew what she was. That rearrangement, the conversation becoming a different kind of conversation. He didn't find it. What he found was a person sitting on a sawhorse in a construction site at 11 in the morning, holding a cup of coffee in both hands, telling him the truth. "You have to understand," he said, "why this is hard." "I do." "Not abstractly, you have to actually understand it." He put his coffee down on the windowsill. 4 years ago I had a business partner and a fiancé and a future I thought I understood. And I found out in the same week that both of them had been careful with me about things that mattered, and I understand their reasons too. Everyone has reasons. He looked at the restored section of the ceiling, that gleaming difference. I rebuilt around that. I built a life that was small enough that I could see all of it, and that was okay. That was working. And then you met me, she said, and then I met you. She was quiet. "And it doesn't matter," he said, and heard his voice come out rougher than he intended, "that the numbers are different or that the secret was different. The architecture is the same. Someone I was letting in was holding something back. And I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to rebuild trust that I haven't finished building the first time." Victoria set her coffee down on the floor beside the sawhorse. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at him with an expression that was not trying to fix anything, which was, he registered, even in the middle of it, not the response he'd been braced for. "I know," she said. "That's all? What else do you want me to say?" Not defensive, genuinely asking. "I'm not going to tell you that I was right to wait that long, because I wasn't. I'm not going to tell you that it's different because the intention was different, because I know that's not how it lands on your end." She looked at the half-restored floor between them. "I made a choice to protect myself, and I made it too many times in a row, and by the time I understood what that was costing, I didn't know how to walk it back without making it worse." He looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not a managed sorry. I'm actually sorry." He believed her. That was the problem. He believed her. He'd believed Rachel, too, at the end, when she'd cried in their kitchen and said she hadn't meant for it to happen, and he'd believed that also, and being right about believing her had not actually helped with anything. "I need time," he said. "I know that's not—" "Take it," she said immediately. "Ethan, take whatever time you need. I'm not going to show up with arguments or reasons. I already told you everything I have to tell you." She stood up from the sawhorse, picking up her coffee. She looked around the space one more time, the ceiling, the floors, the old window glass. This is going to be extraordinary when it's finished. She walked to the front door. He didn't stop her. At the door she paused. "I looked up the theater," she said. The Art Deco one from when you were a kid. I found the address. He looked at her. There's a parking structure there now, she said. A bad one. The kind where you can still see the outline of the original building in the foundation. She opened the door. I just thought you should know someone else looked. She left. He sat in the bookstore for a long time after, in the cold, with the flat December light coming through the old wavy glass, throwing irregular patterns on the raw wood floor and the ceiling above him half restored, half waiting. He ended it 2 days later. Not because he had decided she was wrong or that he was right. Not because he'd stopped believing her. He ended it because he had reached inside himself for whatever it would take to move forward and found, in that particular moment, that the tank was empty. The capacity for trust, for the sustained effort of rebuilding something in yourself while also building something with someone else, the sheer work of it. He didn't have it. He was running a construction project on himself that had started 4 years ago and wasn't finished, and he did not have enough materials left over to also build what she needed. That was the honest version. The less honest version was that he was scared, and he knew he was scared, and knowing didn't fix it. He called her. He didn't text because what he had to say didn't belong in a text. She answered, and he said, I think we should stop. And she was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that he heard her exhale slowly on the other end. Okay, she said. I'm not saying this because I think you're Ethan. Her voice was steady, not brittle. You don't have to qualify it. I understand. You're not going to argue. No. He stood in his kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The Dada magnet caught the light. That makes it harder, he said. I know. A pause. Take care of yourself. Take care of Lily. She hung up first. He stood there with the phone in his hand for a long time after. December in New York did what December always did. It made the city feel both more alive and more exhausting. Strung lights and cold wind, and the relentless pace of people trying to finish the year, as if there were points awarded for completion. Ethan worked. He finished the subfloor repair on the bookstore. He navigated the client's evolving opinions about the ceiling restoration, which kept expanding in scope every time the client came to the site and saw another section uncovered, because that was what happened when people saw old things made clean. They wanted more of it. He picked up Lily from school. He went to her winter performance, which involved 17 5-year-olds wearing paper snowflakes and singing a song about penguins that bore no relationship to any penguin song he'd ever heard, and was apparently an original composition by their teacher, Ms. Fairbanks, who accepted the applause with the quiet dignity of someone who had been singing penguin songs in December for 15 years and had made peace with it. He sat in the school gymnasium on a metal folding chair and watched Lily execute the penguin dance with the focus of someone who did not consider this a casual commitment, and he thought about nothing except her face, which was the only subject that could, temporarily, crowd everything else out. Marcus came to Christmas dinner, which they had in Ethan's apartment with Mrs. Petrov from next door, who brought a dish she described as a traditional Romanian recipe that Ethan was fairly sure she invented annually. Lily put a paper crown from a Christmas cracker on Marcus's head and made him wear it the entire meal, and Marcus wore it without complaint and helped himself to a third portion of Mrs. Petrov's indeterminate dish and said it was excellent, which it was. After dinner, after Mrs. Petrov had gone home and Lily was asleep, Marcus and Ethan sat at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of scotch that Marcus had brought. You don't have to talk about it, Marcus said. I know. But I'm here if you want to. Ethan turned his glass on the table. Outside, the city was doing its Christmas night thing, quieter than usual, which in New York meant something, like a chord resolving. She never tried to change my mind, he said. Marcus waited. When I called to end it, she didn't argue. She didn't try to convince me I was wrong. He looked at his glass. And I keep thinking that's either the most manipulative thing a person can do or the most decent. Which do you think it is? He was quiet for a moment. Decent, he said. I think it's just decent. Marcus didn't say anything. He was good at that, knowing when the observation was meant to be received, not responded to. She found the theater, Ethan said. What theater? The Art Deco theater from when I was a kid, the one that got torn down. He picked up his glass. I told her about it on the first date. She looked it up. She found the address. She looked at what's there now. He paused. She told me right before she left the bookstore that day. She wasn't using it. She just thought I should know. Marcus looked at him. That's not the action of someone who was managing the situation. No, Ethan said. It's not. Marcus refilled both glasses. I was afraid, Ethan said. Not to Marcus specifically, to the kitchen, to the night, to the refrigerator with its crooked magnet. I know I was afraid. I know the difference between afraid and right. He stopped. I ran out of whatever it was going to take. You can get more, Marcus said. Can you? Yeah. Marcus put down the bottle. You're not actually a person who gives up. You've been pretending to be one for 4 years, but you're not. Ethan looked at him. The bookstore, Marcus said. The subfloor. The client who wanted to compromise. And you who kept working on the plans even after they agreed because you wanted it right. You don't actually walk away from things you believe in. He picked up his glass. You're scared of her. You're not done with her. Those are different problems. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. January arrived with the particular bleakness that January specialized in. The holiday momentum gone, the gray settled in for its long visit, the city stripped of its festive overlay and revealed as just itself, cold and functional and honest. Ethan went back to the bookstore and threw himself into the ceiling restoration, which was consuming in the way that detailed technical work was consuming. It demanded a particular kind of attention that left no bandwidth for anything else. He was getting better at not thinking about her. He was not, in fact, getting better at not thinking about her. The thing that kept surfacing, at the worksite, at 3 a.m, in the grocery store on Saturday mornings when Lily put things in the cart without asking and he was too tired to argue, was the specific quality of her attention. The way she'd sat across from him and asked questions that meant she was actually tracking what he said, not just waiting for a gap to talk. The way she'd looked at the pressed tin ceiling at Foundry. The way she'd eaten a piece of his daughter's pretzel and asked what Lily was interested in. He thought about her saying, I find that it makes me perform instead of just being there. He thought about himself on the blind date with a wrinkled jacket and a coffee stain, wanting to be uninteresting enough that she'd leave. And she hadn't. She'd laughed at his terrible joke and asked about the theater and split the creme brulee and tapped the top too gently the first time and made a face. He thought about the fact that he had also been hiding. Not in the same way, not a specific secret, not a fact he was concealing, but himself, the version of himself that was capable of wanting something. He had taken that person and put him somewhere safe, behind the predictable routine and the manageable life and the very detailed knowledge of architectural history. And he had been telling himself for 4 years that this was wisdom. Marcus had said, You're not actually a person who gives up. The bookstore ceiling was almost finished by the 3rd week of January. Ethan stood on the scaffolding one afternoon and looked at the full length of it, the restored sections glowing even in the weak winter light, the original tin pattern clear and complete, everything that had been obscured brought back. He had spent months on this. He had solved problems that were supposed to be unsolvable, found materials that were supposed to be unavailable, talked a client down from compromises that would have made the whole thing lesser. He was looking at it when his phone rang. He expected Marcus. He expected the client. He expected a vendor about a materials order. The name on the screen was one he hadn't seen in 5 weeks. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Ethan. Her voice was the same. He hadn't expected it to be different, but it still landed somewhere specific in his chest. I'm sorry to call. I told myself I wasn't going to call. A pause. But something happened and I thought you should know, and I didn't want you to find out from Marcus or from someone else. He gripped the scaffolding railing. What happened? The bookstore, she said. The lease. I know you're almost done with the restoration, and I know the owner. She stopped. Ethan, the building went up for sale last week. There's a developer who's made an offer, and the owner's landlord, the building owner, is seriously considering it. The developer wants to demolish and build residential. He went very still on the scaffolding. How do you know this? He said. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to be its own answer. He looked at the restored ceiling, at the months of work above him, at the original tin, clean and complete. "Victoria." "It came across my desk," she said quietly. "The developer runs a fund we've looked at. That's how I saw it." Another pause. "I'm not involved. I didn't do anything. I just saw the paperwork and I thought you should know." He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "How long does he have to make a decision?" "The offer window is 3 weeks." 3 weeks, he repeated. "I'm sorry," she said. I know this isn't a good call for either of us. I just couldn't not tell you." He stood on the scaffolding in the unfinished bookstore with the completed ceiling above him and the exposed floor below, and the old wavy glass in the front window holding the gray January light. And he thought about the Art Deco theater that nobody had fought for. The parking structure that stood where it used to be. The outline of the original building still visible in the foundation if you knew how to look. He thought about her saying, "I just thought you should know someone else looked." "Thank you for calling," he said. "Of course." He started to say goodbye. He stopped. "Victoria." "Yes." He couldn't find the words for what he wanted to say, which was something about the fact that she had called him, that she hadn't needed to, and she had. That she had said, "I just couldn't not tell you," without making it about anything other than what it was. He couldn't find the words for the thing that had been growing in the back of his chest for 5 weeks, the thing he'd been calling absence, but that was starting to feel more like knowledge. "I'll figure something out," he said, "with the bookstore." "I know you will," she said. He hung up. He stood on the scaffolding for another few minutes, not moving, looking at the ceiling he'd spent 5 months restoring, thinking about what it meant to save a thing, what it cost, and what it was worth, and how the work looked different depending on whether you believed the thing was worth saving before you started. He climbed down the scaffolding. He sat on an upturned crate in the middle of the main room with his elbows on his knees, looking at the restored floor, the clean ceiling, the windows. He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts and stared at her name for a long time. Then he started making calls. Not to her, to the people who might be able to help save the bookstore. The City Preservation Office contact he'd been cultivating for 3 years. The community board member who owed him a favor from a brownstone project in 2021. The journalist at the local paper who wrote about neighborhoods and had been looking for a story about displacement. He worked the phone for 2 hours, cold in the unfinished space, breath visible in the January air. Because that was the other thing about Ethan Walker, the thing that coexisted with the fear and the history and the careful small life he'd constructed. He did not walk away from things he believed in. He just sometimes needed to remember which things those were. The bookstore campaign took on a life of its own in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely comfortable with. It started with the journalist, a woman named Carla Reyes, who wrote a column for a neighborhood paper that had somehow survived the collapse of local journalism by being relentlessly specific about the blocks it covered. Ethan had called her on a Tuesday afternoon from the cold bookstore floor, explained the situation in about 4 minutes, and she had said, "Can I come see it?" He'd said yes, and she'd come the next morning with a photographer, and the story that ran Friday was not the measured preservation piece Ethan had imagined. It was a story about a neighborhood losing its last remaining independent bookstore to a developer, with photographs of the restored ceiling that made it look, in the flat winter light, like something from a different century coming back to life. The story got picked up, not by major outlets, by neighborhood blogs, then by a preservation advocacy group that had been looking for a local case to rally around, then by a city council member who was running for re-election on a platform that included the preservation of what she called authentic neighborhood character, a phrase Ethan found somewhat bloodless but did not say so because she was making phone calls on his behalf, and that was what mattered. Within 10 days, there were people Ethan didn't know showing up at the bookstore to look at what was being saved. Community board meetings he'd never attended before suddenly had agenda items with his name on them. A petition circulated. He went to the community board meeting and spoke for 7 minutes about the building's history and the restoration work and the specific kind of irreplaceable loss that happened when a 100-year-old commercial space was replaced with residential units that would list for $3,000 a month. And he was not a natural public speaker. He was too direct, too technical. He forgot to pause for effect, but he meant every word of it, and the room could tell the difference. The building owner, a man named Gerald Park, who had inherited the property from his father, and who seemed, in Ethan's read of him, to be genuinely conflicted rather than purely mercenary, agreed to delay his decision for an additional 30 days while the community response was assessed. 30 days. Ethan spent those 30 days doing the work, not just the bookstore restoration, which was entering its final phase, the front facade, the original sign bracket, the last of the ceiling trim, but the preservation argument, which required a different kind of craft. He learned more about landmark designation processes in 2 weeks than he had in 5 years of professional work. He sat in the city preservation office waiting room for 3 hours to get 20 minutes with a staff member who told him the timeline for landmark designation was, realistically, longer than 30 days, but who also gave him the name of a nonprofit that had found creative workarounds for exactly this kind of situation. He called the nonprofit. They knew the situation already. They'd read Carla's piece. They had ideas. A historic easement, potentially. A community land trust, if the owner could be convinced. None of it was simple. All of it required time and money and the sustained attention of people who had other things to do. What he didn't do during those 30 days was call Victoria. Not because he'd decided anything, not because he'd sorted out the tangle of what he felt into something organized and presentable. He didn't call because he was moving at a pace that didn't leave room for the conversation he actually needed to have with her. And he knew himself well enough to know that if he called her mid-crisis, he'd use the crisis as cover. He'd talk about the bookstore and not say the other thing. He was done using things as cover. He knew that. He just hadn't figured out yet what to do with the knowledge. Marcus came to the bookstore on a Saturday in early February, ostensibly to help but practically to assess the situation, which was Marcus's way. He arrived with useful hands and inconvenient observations in roughly equal measure. He helped move scaffolding. He held things while Ethan fastened them. He looked at the finished ceiling for a long time and said, "This is really something," in the tone of someone who had not expected to be moved by a tin ceiling and was annoyed to find that he was. "Don't tell me I was right," Ethan said. "About the ceiling or about the other thing?" "Either." Marcus held the other end of a trim piece while Ethan positioned it. "She knows about the campaign," he said. "Priya told her. She's been following it." Ethan focused on the trim piece. "I figured. She hasn't reached out again." "I know. She told Priya she was going to let you, and I'm quoting, find your own way to the door." End quote. Ethan looked at him. That's what she said. Word for word, according to Priya. Marcus held his end steady. "It's a good line. It implies I'm lost." "Are you?" He positioned the last section of trim. "Hold it there." He fastened the first bracket. The trim settled into place, flush and clean, the way a thing looked when all the preparation had been done correctly. He stepped back and looked at it and felt the specific satisfaction of a finished detail, which was the satisfaction that had gotten him through the last 4 months. "No," he said. "I don't think I am anymore." Marcus looked at him with the expression of someone filing information for later use. He did not say anything else about it, which was one of the things Ethan valued most about him. The bookstore situation resolved in a way that was partial and imperfect, and better than it had looked 3 weeks earlier, which was the general nature of preservation victories. Gerald Park did not sell to the developer. What he did, after a long conversation with the nonprofit and a longer conversation with his own apparent conscience, was agree to a historic easement that would restrict the building's demolition for 25 years and provide tax benefits that offset what he would have made on the developer's offer. Not completely, but enough. The bookstore tenant, a 67-year-old woman named Estelle Marks, who had run the shop for 19 years and had been operating under the assumption that she had another year before displacement, signed a new 10-year lease at a rate that didn't make her cry, which she said was the first lease she'd signed in a decade that didn't. Ethan was at the bookstore the morning Estelle got the call about the new lease. He was finishing the last section of the front facade when she came out onto the sidewalk and stood there in the February cold without a coat and looked at the restored exterior with an expression that had too many things in it to name. He climbed down from the ladder because it seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at him. She said, My father used to bring me to a bookstore like this when I was 6, in Brooklyn. They knocked it down in 1987. He didn't say anything. I always thought I was just running a shop, she said. I didn't know I was doing what you do. He looked at the facade. The original stone cleaned, the woodwork painted the correct dark green that historical records had confirmed, the sign bracket restored and waiting for the new sign Estelle had already designed. You were keeping something alive, he said. That's the same work. She patted his arm once, briskly, in the manner of someone who had used up their allocation of sentiment and was moving back to practicality, and went inside. He climbed back up the ladder and finished the last section. He was packing up his tools an hour later when he understood something. He stood in the empty bookstore with his tool bag at his feet, and the finished ceiling above him, and the late February light coming through the old glass. And he thought about what Estelle had said. I always thought I was just running a shop. And he thought about the 4 months he'd spent on this building, the problems he'd solved and the arguments he'd made, and the early mornings in the cold, and he thought about why. It wasn't because it was his job. He did plenty of jobs that he cared about professionally, and not much more than that. It was because he believed it was worth saving. He believed that before he had proof. He'd walked into this building last August and seen the laminate covering the hardwood and the paint, obscuring the tin and the water damage in the back corner, and he'd believed, without evidence, that there was something under all of it worth the work. And he'd been right, but the belief had come first. That was what faith looked like in his field. Not anything mystical, just, you decide something is worth the effort before you know for certain that it is. He stood in the bookstore for a long time with that thought, turning it over the way he'd been turning other things over for weeks. Then he picked up his tool bag and walked out. He called Marcus that evening. I need Priya's number, he said. A pause. Why? Because I need to ask her something, and I need to do it before I overthink it. Ethan. Marcus. Another pause, then, hold on. Priya answered on the third ring, surprised to hear from him, but not unfriendly. He'd met her a handful of times. Smart, direct, the kind of person who asked the question behind the question. He appreciated that. I need to know if she's okay, he said. Not details. Not anything she hasn't said directly. I just need to know if she's... I need to know how she is. Priya was quiet for a moment. She's working. She's always working. That's not new. Another pause. She went to see the bookstore, you know. She stood outside and looked at the facade. She didn't go in. He sat very still. When? He said. 2 weeks ago. She took a cab there on a Sunday morning. She stood there for about 10 minutes and then went home. A pause. She didn't tell me I couldn't tell you. He looked at the kitchen ceiling, the water stain from the upstairs leak, the light that needed a new bulb, the ordinary inventory of his apartment at 9:30 on a February evening. Is she free Saturday? He said. Priya made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. I'll let her know you called. He spent Friday this way he always spent the night before something that mattered. Not preparing exactly, but restless in a specific way. Moving through the apartment, doing small tasks that didn't need doing, checking on Lily twice without waking her, standing at the kitchen window at 11:30, watching the street below. He thought about what he was going to say. He ran through versions of it, which was an instinct he didn't trust in himself. The architecture of planned sincerity was still architecture, still a structure built to produce an effect. He had been accusing her in his mind of managing things, and here he was managing things. He stopped planning. What he had, without arrangement, was this. He had been wrong about what the problem was. He had identified the hiding and called it a betrayal, and used that to protect himself from the more complicated truth, which was that he had been letting fear make decisions for him for 4 years, and calling it wisdom. And somewhere in the course of 12 weeks, and a woman who asked good questions, and a restored tin ceiling, and a bookstore that almost got demolished, he had lost his tolerance for that particular self-deception. That was what he had. He didn't have a speech. He didn't have a plan. On Saturday morning, he arranged for Marcus to take Lily to the Natural History Museum, which Lily had been lobbying for since December, and which Marcus had agreed to with the enthusiasm of a man who secretly wanted to see the dinosaur exhibit and needed an excuse. He kissed Lily on the head. He told her to be good. She said she was always good. He said he knew she thought that. He texted Victoria at 9 a.m. Can I come to you this time? The reply came in 4 minutes. Yes, I'll send the address. The address she sent was not what he expected. He'd constructed a version of her life in his head. The penthouse, probably, or a floor-through in some building that had a doorman who knew not to make eye contact. The specific aesthetics of extreme wealth as he'd always imagined them. Impersonal, scalable, every surface communicating its own value. The address was in Brooklyn. Carroll Gardens, a brownstone on a quiet block, 4 stories, the facade a warm reddish brown, window boxes that were empty now in February, but that clearly held plants in season. There was a small stoop with an iron railing, slightly ornate, original to the building. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment before going up. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd heard him on the stoop. She was wearing a dark gray sweater and jeans, no shoes, her hair down. She looked like she'd been up for a while. There was coffee in her hand and the focused quiet of someone who had been working before he arrived. She looked at him on the stoop and said, "Hi." "Hi." She stepped back to let him in. The inside was not what he'd expected either, and this surprised him more. It was full, not cluttered, but inhabited, the particular quality of a place that had been lived in rather than designed. Books on every surface that had a flat edge, stacked horizontally in the way people stacked books when they'd run out of shelf space and couldn't stop acquiring more. A worn leather sofa with a throw blanket that had clearly been used last night. A kitchen at the back visible through a doorway. Copper pots on a rack. A cutting board that looked like it had been in service for 20 years. On the far wall of the living room was a framed architectural drawing. A building in elevation, detailed and old, the lines done by hand. He walked toward it. "That's a Beaux-Arts building on Fifth Avenue," she said from behind him. "Built 1902, demolished 1952. I found the original drawing at an estate sale in Connecticut." A pause. "I bought it before I knew it was a demolished building. When I found out, I thought about taking it down, but—" She stopped. "But it's more honest up," he said. "Yes." He looked at it for another moment. Then he turned around. She was standing in the middle of the room with her coffee mug and no armor. That was the thing, was no management, no strategy he could detect, no version of herself arranged for the room. She was just standing there, in her socks, with her coffee, looking at him with the same quality of attention she'd had from the beginning. "I owe you an honest account," he said. "You don't owe me anything. Let me finish." He said it gently but clearly, and she closed her mouth and waited. "When you told me, when I found out what you were hiding, I said it was about trust. And it was. But it wasn't only that." He looked at the rug between them, then back at her. "I was afraid, and I had this ready-made reason, this legitimate grievance, and I used it to justify the fear, which is, I'm not proud of that." She didn't say anything. "And I've been standing still for 4 years and calling it stability," he said. "I've been keeping everything small enough to control and telling myself that was wisdom, that it was what Lily needed, that it was what I needed." He stopped. "And you showed up at a blind date that I was trying to fail, and everything I'd told myself started sounding like what it actually was, which is a story. A story I'd been telling myself so long I'd stopped hearing it." Victoria set her coffee mug on the table beside her. She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she needed to hold on to something. "I'm not saying I was wrong to be hurt," he said. "I'm saying I was wrong to stop there, to use being hurt as the destination instead of a place I passed through." He looked at her. "You looked up the theater." Her expression shifted. "You stood outside the bookstore on a Sunday morning 2 weeks ago," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. "Priya." She said you didn't tell her she couldn't. When she opened her eyes again, there was something undefended in them. "I didn't trust myself to go in," she said. "I didn't know if it would be... I didn't know if you'd want me to. I would have wanted you to." She looked at him. "You ended it, Ethan. I know. I wasn't going to..." She stopped. "I told myself I wasn't going to be someone who showed up and argued. I had given you all the information and I needed to let you make your own decision. She looked at the rug, then up. That was the hardest thing I've done in a long time. Not calling, not showing up, not trying to fix it with... She gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed, he understood, everything she could have deployed and had chosen not to. I know, he said. I know you didn't. It wasn't strategy, she said, and her voice came out with an edge that was not anger, but was something adjacent to it, the edge of a person who needed to be believed about this specific thing. I didn't stay away because I thought it would work. I stayed away because it was the right thing to do, because you deserve to make your own choice. I know that too, he said. That's what I'm telling you. I know. The room was quiet. Outside, the street was doing its Saturday morning thing. A car went by, someone's dog barked twice and stopped, the general low evidence of the city continuing. I'm not the same person who walked into that restaurant in October, he said. I was running a very tight ship, and I'd convinced myself the tightness was the point. I'm still not... He stopped, because honesty required this. I'm still going to be difficult sometimes. I'm still going to need room. I'm not walking in here to tell you I fixed myself. I don't want you fixed, she said. I never wanted that. I know. He looked at her. I want to try. Not from October. We already did October. We already did November. And most of what happened then was real, and I'd like to keep it. I want to try from here, from what we know now. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the architectural drawing on the wall behind him, the demolished building, preserved in lines. Then she looked back at him. I want complete honesty, she said, not because I'm making terms, because that's the only way I know how to do this right. When something's happening at work that matters, you'll know. When I'm having a bad week, I'll say so, when something scares me. She looked at him directly. And I want you to do the same, not the managed version, the actual one. Yes, he said. I'm going to need you to be patient with me when I default to managing things, she said. I've been doing it for so long it happens before I notice. A pause. I'll need you to tell me when it's happening. I can do that, he said. You'll need to tell me when I'm using work to avoid things I should be saying out loud. She almost smiled. I've already been doing that. I know. They looked at each other across the rug, the quiet room, the accumulated evidence of her actual life. The books, the worn sofa, the copper pots, the demolished building on the wall. He thought about how wrong his version of this apartment had been. He thought about how many versions of her he'd built in his head that hadn't been right, and how the one standing in front of him in socks with no armor and a coffee mug was the one that was real. Come here, she said. It was a simple thing to say. No ceremony. Just those 2 words, in the practical tone of someone who was done with the distance. He crossed the room. She didn't make it dramatic. She just put her arms around him and he put his around her, and they stood in the middle of her living room in February, and neither of them said anything, because after 4 months and all those words and all that careful distance, the thing that was called for was not more words. He felt her exhale, a long, slow release, the sound of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and had finally put it down. He understood exactly what that felt like. He told Lily that evening, not the full story, she was 5, but he told her that his friend Victoria was going to be around more, and Lily looked at him with the calculating gaze of someone who had been filing information for months, and said, The lady from the park. Yes? With the pretzel. She ate part of your pretzel, yes. Lily considered this from her position at the kitchen table, where she had been in the middle of a drawing that appeared to be either a dinosaur or an extremely complicated cloud. She can come to the park again, she said, and went back to her drawing. Ethan sat across from her and watched her draw for a few minutes in the good quiet of the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The data magnet caught the light. Outside, the late February evening was doing the thing that February evenings in New York sometimes did right at the end of the month, hinting, very briefly, at the possibility of something warmer coming. Daddy, Lily said without looking up. Yeah. Did you find your way to the door? He looked at her. She was still drawing. He had absolutely no idea what she meant or where she'd heard that, and the randomness of children's observations was something he had 3 years of parenthood with and still hadn't gotten used to. Yeah, he said. I think I did. Good, she said, and added a new feature to the dinosaur cloud that seemed intentional and decisive. I'm hungry. He got up and started making dinner. But the following weeks were not a clean start. Clean starts were a myth. What actually happened was that life continued in its particular mixture of good and difficult and ordinary, and you navigated it with someone beside you instead of alone. And some days that made everything easier, and some days it complicated things in ways you hadn't anticipated. Victoria came to Astoria for dinner on a Thursday and burned the garlic bread genuinely and completely, while Ethan was busy with Lily's bath. And they ate dinner with the window open in February to clear the smoke, and Lily found this incredibly funny, and Victoria laughed too, the real version of her laugh that Ethan had cataloged from the first night. And he stood at the stove thinking, there it is. The way you thought about something you'd been missing without letting yourself know you were missing it. He met her actual assistant for the first time on a Tuesday when he stopped by her office, a glass and steel building in Midtown that, he had to admit, was impressive in the specific way of buildings designed to communicate the weight of what happened inside them. The assistant, a man named James who had the organized calm of someone who had seen everything and chose to respond to none of it, greeted him with precise professional courtesy, and then, when Victoria was a moment away from her previous meeting, said quietly, "She talks about the bookstore." He said it without inflection, as information delivered to someone who deserved to have it, and then went back to his desk. He met her board chair at an event she brought him to in March, a dinner for a real estate nonprofit, the kind of event where Ethan spent most of the time trying not to look like what he was, which was a freelance architect from Queens who had come in a jacket that was slightly better than his usual jacket, but was still, he recognized, not quite the caliber of jacket in the room. The board chair was a 70-year-old woman named Margaret, who shook his hand and said, "You're the one who saved the bookstore." And when he said he'd had help, she said, "Victoria told me what you did. The community work. The preservation argument." And then she said, "You should talk to her about the foundation," and moved on to another conversation. He looked at Victoria across the room. She was talking to someone, wineglass in hand, clearly in the register she used for these events, which was slightly different from her other registers, more contained. And she caught his eye and raised her eyebrows very slightly in a question. "Okay?" He gave her the look that meant, "Tell me about the foundation." She gave him the look that meant, "Later." He turned back to the room and talked to the man standing next to him, who turned out to be a structural engineer who had strong opinions about concrete restoration, and they had an excellent 20-minute conversation. And Ethan thought that this was perhaps what it looked like when your life expanded to include things you hadn't planned for. Not a transformation, not a clean new chapter, just more. More room, more conversation, more possibility that the unexpected person standing next to you has something worth hearing. The foundation conversation happened 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in her Brooklyn kitchen, coffee on the table, the copper pots on their rack catching the March light. She put her mug down and said, "I've been thinking about something and I want your honest response, not a polite one." "Okay. I want to start a foundation, preservation of historic community spaces. Not just buildings, but the function. Bookstores, community centers, cultural spaces that are getting priced out or demolished." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about it for a while, but the bookstore made it concrete." He was quiet. "I want someone who actually understands the work to lead the restoration projects," she said. "Not to run the foundation. I don't mean that. I mean the specific work of going into these spaces and figuring out what can be saved and how." She looked at him steadily. "I thought of you before we got back together. I'm telling you that so you know the idea is real and not just a way to—" "I know," he said. "Do you want to think about it?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. He thought about Estelle Marx standing on the sidewalk without a coat. He thought about the Art Deco theater, the parking structure, the outline of the original foundation still visible if you knew how to look. He thought about what it meant to do work you believed in, with resources adequate to actually doing it right, without the constant grinding compromise between what was necessary and what was fundable. "Yes," he said. "I want to think about it." "Okay," she said, and picked up her coffee. "I want to do it," he said. She lowered the mug, looked at him. "I don't need to think about it," he said. "I know what I think. I think it's the right work, and I think you're the right person to back it. And I think I've spent enough time not doing things because I was waiting to be certain. He looked at her. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We're going to disagree about scope sometimes. Definitely. And funding decisions. Probably. And I'm going to want to go bigger faster than you're comfortable with. And I'm going to want to slow down and get it right more than you're comfortable with." She tilted her head slightly. "That sounds like it works." "It sounds like it works," he agreed. She picked up her mug. He picked up his. Outside, March was doing what March did in New York. One day convincing you that winter was over, the next reminding you it wasn't. The whole month the negotiation between what was ending and what was coming. The light through the kitchen window was the particular pale gold of an early spring morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to hold. It was, Ethan thought, not a bad morning to make a decision. The foundation didn't have a name for the first 3 weeks. This bothered Victoria more than she admitted, and bothered Ethan less than she thought it should, which was itself a small preview of how they would work together. Her wanting the infrastructure in place before the work began, him wanting to do the work and let the infrastructure follow. They argued about it on a Tuesday evening in her Brooklyn kitchen while Lily sat at the table doing her homework with the focused energy of a 6-year-old who had recently discovered that if she finished her work without complaint, she got to stay up 20 minutes later, a system she had negotiated with Ethan directly and with considerable sophistication for someone who still occasionally put her shoes on the wrong feet. "We need a name before we file," Victoria said, not for the first time. "We need a structure before a name," Ethan said. "The name is just a label on a box we haven't finished building. The name shapes how people think about what we're doing. Then we should know what we're doing first." Lily looked up from her homework. "Cornerstone," she said. They both looked at her. She looked back down at her homework. "That's what you call the thing at the bottom of a building. Daddy told me. It's the first thing and everything else goes on top." She erased something carefully. "That's what you're doing, right?" Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. "Cornerstone Foundation," Victoria said, trying it. "It's good," he said. "She's 6. She's been listening to me talk about building since she was 3. She has context." Victoria looked at Lily, who had returned to her homework with the composure of someone who had said her piece and considered the matter concluded. "Lily," Victoria said, "that's a very good name." Lily said, "I know," without looking up. Victoria wrote it down. Ethan looked at the ceiling to hide the expression on his face. And that was how the Cornerstone Foundation got its name, on a Tuesday night in a Brooklyn kitchen, from a 6-year-old who had strong opinions about architecture and even stronger opinions about staying up past 8:30. They filed the paperwork in April. By May, they had their first 3 project inquiries, a shuttered community theater in the Bronx that had been sitting empty for 11 years, a Caribbean cultural center in Crown Heights, whose building needed structural work it couldn't afford, and a public library branch in Staten Island that was facing closure due to a city budget decision that nobody seemed willing to own publicly. Ethan went to see all 3 in the same week, driving a rental car to Staten Island on a Wednesday morning, because that was the only way to get there with the time he had, and standing in each space the way he always stood in buildings he was assessing, quietly, for longer than strictly necessary, trying to understand what the building was before he decided what it could be. The Bronx Theater was the one that made his chest do something he recognized. A 1931 vaudeville house that had been converted to a community theater in the 1970s, 200 seats, a stage that was structurally sound but cosmetically devastated. Original plasterwork on the proscenium arch that had been damaged by a roof leak and then abandoned. He stood in the middle of the house and looked at the arch and thought, "This is fixable. All of this is fixable." And then he thought, immediately after, "That's what you always think." And then, "You've been right more often than you've been wrong." He called Victoria from the parking lot. "The Bronx Theater," he said. "I know which one you mean," she said. "You're going to say yes." "I'm saying yes. I already started the preliminary financial assessment." He leaned against the rental car. "When did you do that?" "Yesterday, when you texted me the address. I hadn't decided yet yesterday." "I know. A pause, and he could hear the smile in it. But I know how you sound when you're going to say yes. He looked up at the theater's facade, a terracotta front, ornate by the standards of the neighborhood, the kind of building that announced itself as something worth noticing even in the state it was in. We're going to disagree about the timeline, he said. Correct. I'm going to want 18 months minimum. I was thinking 12. Victoria. I was thinking 12, and then I was going to let you talk me to 15, she said. 15 is where I actually land. He stood there in the April sun with the phone to his ear and thought about the first time he'd heard her voice. Across a restaurant table, talking about a cab driver's theory of Manhattan's one-way streets. He thought about how far they were from that night, and how close, how both things were true simultaneously. 15, he said, and I want the plasterwork done by a specialist, not a general contractor. I'll find you a specialist. Not just any specialist, the right one. Ethan, I have resources. I know you have resources. I've been watching you deploy them for 3 months. I'm saying I want input on this specific decision. A beat. Okay, we'll decide together. Thank you. You're welcome, she said, and then, are you going home tonight, or are you going to stand in that parking lot looking at the facade for another hour? He had in fact been looking at the facade. He hadn't known it was that obvious. How do you know I'm looking at it? Because you always look at them for longer than you need to, she said. I've been paying attention. He looked at the building for another moment, all its damage and its dignity, everything broken and everything worth saving coexisting in the same terracotta face. I'll be home by 7, he said. Lily has her thing tomorrow, the school presentation. I know, I have it on 3 calendars. She's nervous. She's been practicing on Sergeant Pesto, the pigeon. He's a very patient audience. She laughed, the real version, the one that arrived before she decided to allow it, and said she'd see him tonight, and they hung up. He stayed in the parking lot for another 10 minutes because she was right. He always looked longer than he needed to, and he had stopped being embarrassed about that. The school presentation was about animals, and Lily had chosen, with characteristic independence, to present on pigeons. Ethan sat in the back of the classroom on a child-sized chair with his knees up near his chin and watched his daughter stand in front of her class with a poster that she had made herself, hand-drawn, detailed, with labels that were spelled with varying success, and explain the homing instinct of pigeons with the authority of someone who had been conducting field research for over a year. Her teacher, Ms. Fairbanks, stood to one side with the expression of someone watching a natural event unfold. The other children were attentive in the way of 6-year-olds, which meant 3 of them were extremely focused and the others were approximately in the room. They always come home, Lily said at the end about the pigeons. Even if they go far away, they know which way home is. She looked at her poster, then at her class. I think that's important, Ms. Fairbanks asked for questions. A boy named Marcus, coincidentally, asked if pigeons were related to dinosaurs. Lily said technically all birds were and moved on. Another child asked if Sergeant Pesto had ever gotten lost. Lily said no, and then, after a beat, said, he knows where to come back to. Ethan looked at the back of his daughter's head, her hair in 2 uneven braids because she insisted on doing them herself now, and he hadn't yet won the argument about letting him help, and thought about a morning in October when he had stood at a kitchen window watching the sky and dreaded an evening that turned into the first hours of something he hadn't been capable of naming yet. He thought about what Lily had said, in the way children sometimes said things that arrived from a place adults had stopped having access to. They always come home. He thought about the theater in his hometown, demolished when he was 17. He thought about the bookstore on the Lower East Side, its tin ceiling glowing. He thought about the Bronx Theater, the plaster arch, the fixable damage. He thought about the very specific quality of Victoria's attention, the way she had listened to him talk about that demolished theater on a first date with her head slightly tilted and her coffee going cold in front of her, not performing interest but actually tracking where he was going. He thought about the fact that he had spent 4 years building a life designed to contain no surprises, and the greatest surprise of that life was that the life had turned out to be insufficient. Lily was answering another question. She stood with her feet slightly apart, her poster in one hand, her expression the expression of someone on solid ground. He thought, I did that. Some of that, I did. She came in knowing how to be herself, and I just tried not to interfere with it. He thought, that's the most I can say for any of it. I tried not to interfere with the things that knew how to be themselves. He sat on the tiny chair in the back of the classroom and understood, in the particular way that understanding sometimes arrived, not gradually but all at once, like a key finding a lock, that this was what the last year had been about. Not learning to trust again, not recovering from something, not building back what had been lost. It had been about learning to stop interfering with the things that knew how to be themselves. Victoria, who had known how to love him in the specific way he needed to be loved and had been right about it from the beginning. Lily, who had known that the pigeon would come back before he could explain why. The bookstore, which had known what it was under the laminate and the paint for 100 years, waiting for someone to take it seriously. And himself, the version of himself that had walked into that restaurant in October with a coffee stain on his collar and a wrinkled jacket and a plan to be uninteresting, who had nonetheless, despite everything, stayed 3 hours past the first cup of coffee. That person had known something he'd spent months trying to argue himself out of. The wedding was in November, not the November that followed that October, a full year after, the November that was the second one, by which time they had both gotten a long look at what they actually were to each other without the anxiety of new discovery. A year of real things, disagreements about foundation timelines and the correct way to restore crumbling plasterwork, and whether Lily's bedtime should be negotiable on weeknights when Victoria was there, and Lily deployed her considerable persuasive resources. A year of Victoria learning that Ethan's silences were not withdrawal but processing, and Ethan learning that Victoria's efficiency was not coldness but the language she'd developed to move through a world that had always required her to be faster and sharper and more certain than she actually felt. A year of Sergeant Pesto continuing to materialize in the park with an attention to pattern that Lily found vindicating and Ethan had stopped pretending to question. A year of the Cornerstone Foundation doing its first real work. The Bronx Theater entering restoration. The Caribbean Cultural Center's structural assessment completed. A small grant program for community spaces that couldn't afford the assessment phase established. 3 applications already received. Ethan at a worksite in the Bronx 3 days a week. Victoria at her Midtown office the other days, both of them at the Brooklyn house in the evenings when they could arrange it, which was not always, which required the ongoing negotiation of 2 people with complicated lives choosing, repeatedly, to make room for each other. He proposed in September, at the bookstore. Not planned exactly. He had thought about it for a while. The ring had been in his jacket pocket for 2 weeks, because he'd bought it and then spent 2 weeks waiting for a moment that didn't feel staged, and the moment he'd imagined kept not arriving, because the moments he imagined were always too clean, too arranged. Estelle Marks had invited them to the reopening of the bookstore, a small event, just the community people who'd fought for it, a few bottles of wine, the space finally finished and functioning, the tin ceiling gleaming, the hardwood floors restored, the shelves full of books arranged in Estelle's particular system, which she had explained to Ethan once, and which he had entirely failed to decode. They were the last ones there, helping Estelle stack folding chairs, and Estelle said she was going to get her bag and would be right back, and Victoria was standing in the middle of the main room looking at the ceiling the way she had the very first time she'd walked into a room with a pressed tin ceiling, that stopped quality, that genuine arrest of attention. And he was standing 10 feet away watching her, and the ring was in his pocket, and the moment was imperfect and unmanaged and completely real. He crossed the room. She turned. He said, "I don't have a speech." She looked at him. "I had one," he said. "I had several. I've been writing them in my head for 2 weeks." He reached into his pocket. "None of them sounded like me." She looked at the ring box in his hand. She looked at his face. "I want to build things with you," he said. "That's the whole thing. Buildings and a foundation and a life. I want to do that with you specifically and not with anyone else." He opened the box. "I'm going to be difficult about timelines, and you're going to want to move faster than I'm comfortable with, and we're going to argue about plasterwork specialists and Lily's bedtime and where to spend holidays, and none of that." He looked at her. "None of that makes me want this any less." Victoria looked at the ring for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, and she blinked once, deliberately, which he had learned was what she did when she was managing something she didn't want to manage. "This is the least romantic proposal I've ever heard," she said. "I know. It's also the most honest one." She looked at him. "Yes." Estelle came back with her bag and found them in the middle of the main room, the ring on Victoria's hand, the ceiling above them complete and gleaming and exactly what it had always been under everything that had obscured it. She looked at them. She put her bag down. She said, "I knew something was going on when you two were the last ones helping with the chairs, but—" The venue was the Bronx Theater. Not finished. The full restoration was ongoing, would be ongoing for another 8 months, but far enough along that the house was safe, and the stage was functional, and the proscenium arch, whose plasterwork had been the first great argument of the Cornerstone Foundation's professional existence, was repaired to a standard that had required Ethan to find a specialist in Philadelphia who had done this exact period of decorative plaster, and who had, upon seeing the arch, said it was among the best preserved examples of its type he'd encountered, which was the kind of sentence that made Ethan feel the project had been worth every complication. The seats were not installed yet. They were refinishing them off-site and bringing them back in December. So the wedding happened in the house with folding chairs arranged in the space where the seats would go, which was, Ethan thought, actually better. It made the proportions of the room visible, the sweep of the floor toward the stage, the height of the ceiling, the way the light from the restored fixtures played across the plaster arch. There were not very many people. That had been a conversation. Victoria's world was large and complex and full of people who would expect to be invited to something, and Ethan's world was small and specific. They had argued about this pleasantly for a month before arriving at a number that satisfied neither of them entirely, and both of them adequately, which was the resolution of most arguments between them. Marcus sat in the third row with Priya, who had cried already at the rehearsal and had come prepared with extra tissues on the day. Marcus had not cried at the rehearsal, but had been suspiciously quiet on the drive home, which Priya had reported to Ethan the next morning as evidence of emotional processing. Margaret, Victoria's board chair, sat in the second row with her husband and looked at the restored arch with the expression of someone who had heard about it for a year and was now deciding what she thought. Mrs. Petrov was in the front row. She had been offered a seat further back and had declined without explanation, relocating herself to the front with the quiet authority of someone who had reached an age where the reason for decisions did not require articulation. Estelle Marx was there. She had brought Carlo Reyes, the journalist who had written the piece that started everything, and the two of them had apparently met once before at a neighborhood event and had opinions about the same local issues that kept the conversation going through the cocktail hour and well into the reception. And Lily was there, of course, at the center of it, the way she was at the center of most things that mattered to Ethan, in a dress that she had chosen herself, dark green because she had decided it was her color, and shoes that she had agreed to wear for the ceremony and to immediately replace with her regular shoes afterward, a negotiation that Ethan had considered a fair outcome. She stood beside Ethan at the front of the house when Victoria came down the aisle, which she did without ceremony or production. She walked, accompanied by her mother, a small, elegant woman from Connecticut who had arrived the day before, and who Ethan had liked immediately for the specific reason that she looked at him the way a person looked at someone they'd been wanting to meet for a while. Victoria walked, and she was in a dress that was not white. She'd said white felt like a performance, and she'd done enough performing. But a deep ivory that, in the light of the restored theater, looked like it belonged to the building. She looked at Ethan walking toward her, and she had the expression she had when something cost her the management. The undefended version. The real one. Lily, standing beside Ethan, said quietly, very quietly, in a voice meant only for him, "She's pretty, Daddy." "Yeah," he said. "She is." "You made a good face." He looked down at her. "What?" "The good kind," Lily said, and looked back at Victoria coming down the aisle. And that was the end of that conversation. The vows were not the traditional version. They had written their own, which had also been a conversation. Ethan had wanted to keep them short, and Victoria had wanted them to be complete. And they had arrived at something that was both, which was the quality they were working toward in most things. Ethan went first. He looked at Victoria in the light of the theater she had helped him save, in the building that had started as a project and become a symbol for something he was still working out how to name, and he said, I spent a long time believing that the safest way to live was to want very little. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was protecting something. He paused. You showed up and ruined that entire plan, which I initially resented and currently consider the best thing that's happened to me since Lily. He looked at her. I'm not going to promise you perfect. I'm not capable of perfect, and neither are you, and that's one of my favorite things about this. I'm going to promise you honest. I'm going to promise you present. I'm going to promise that when I'm afraid, I'll tell you I'm afraid instead of calling it something else. He looked at the ring on her hand, which caught the light. And I'm going to promise that whatever we build it right. Even when right is slower. Even when right is harder. Because that's the only way it lasts. Victoria looked at him for a moment before she started. I have spent most of my adult life being very good at appearing certain, she said. I'm certain about markets and decisions and the structural integrity of investment portfolios. I am not always certain about myself. She looked at Lily, briefly, and then back at Ethan. You looked at me like I was a person before you knew anything about what I controlled. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Her voice held its steadiness, though the effort was visible. I promise to tell you the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I promise to stop managing things when you tell me I'm managing things. I promise to eat dinner at home sometimes instead of at my desk, which I know matters to you and which I am working on. She paused. And I promise to keep looking up, she said, at every ceiling we walk under, at everything you've taught me to see. The room was very quiet. The officiant, a judge who was an old friend of Victoria's mother, and who had a dry, warm quality that Ethan had liked from their one brief meeting, said what was necessary, asked what was necessary, and Ethan and Victoria said yes to the things they were saying yes to. And Lily, who had been assigned the ring, Ethan's, a simple band, and had been holding it with the focus of someone entrusted with something irreplaceable, stepped forward at exactly the right moment and delivered it with ceremony and precision, and then stepped back and folded her hands in front of her with the composure of a professional. Marcus, in the third row, made a sound that was definitively not crying. Priya put a hand on his arm. Mrs. Petrov in the front row said nothing, but she had the expression of someone who was going to have opinions about this for years and was taking notes. The reception was in the lobby of the theater, which was half restored and entirely impractical and exactly right. Caterers had come in and made it work in the way caterers made impossible spaces work, and the result was a room that felt like what it was, an ongoing project, evidence of work in progress, a place that was in the middle of becoming itself. Ethan danced with Lily first, because that was always the agreement, and Lily's approach to dancing was to hold his hands and bounce in approximate time to the music while maintaining a running commentary on everything she observed in the room, which was comprehensive. He spun her once and she screamed with delight and demanded he do it again, and he did it again, and Marcus caught it on his phone, and Ethan was going to have to come to terms with that existing somewhere. Then he danced with Victoria, under the lights of a theater that had been dark for 11 years and was now lit and full, the plaster arch above them repaired and complete, the room echoing with the sound of people talking and music and the irregular ambient noise of a good party in a space that was learning to be lived in again. She put one hand on his shoulder and one in his hand, and they were not elegant dancers. Victoria had admitted she was competent at best, and Ethan's dancing was the dancing of someone who moved with intention, but no particular grace. But they found the rhythm and settled into it, the way they'd found the rhythm of most things. Not immediately, after some adjustment. The arch looks incredible, she said, looking past his shoulder at the proscenium. Don't evaluate the worksite at the wedding, he said. I'm not evaluating. I'm appreciating. You're doing both. She looked at him. It's the same thing for me. He thought about that. He thought about the first time she'd walked into Foundry and stopped just inside the door to look at the pressed tin ceiling. He thought about how he'd watched her see it and how that watching had told him something he hadn't known he was looking for. Yeah, he said. I know. They moved through the music, imperfectly and together, in the lobby of a theater that was in the middle of being restored, surrounded by the people who had gotten them here. Not in a straight line, not cleanly, not without damage. And Ethan looked at the arch and the lights and the imperfect walls and the people and thought about what it meant to build something. He'd spent his career thinking it was about the structures, the bones and the materials and the historical accuracy of the restoration. And that mattered. It still mattered. It would always matter. But what he understood now, standing in the lobby of a 1931 vaudeville house on the night he got married, was that the structures were never the point. They were the container for the point. The thing that lasted wasn't the plaster or the tin or the hardwood. It was what happened inside when the building was allowed to be what it was. The community theater performances and the bookstore readings and the Sunday afternoons and the birthday parties and the quiet Wednesday evenings when nothing happened except that people were in the same room together and the building held them. That was what you were restoring, not the building, the possibility of what could happen inside it. He thought about his daughter, who believed a pigeon had been following them since September of last year, and who was right. He thought about a demolished theater in his hometown, and the parking structure that stood where it used to be, and the outline of the original foundation still visible in the concrete if you knew how to read it. He thought about a pressed tin ceiling at Foundry, never painted over, surviving a century because nobody thought to ruin it. He thought about Victoria standing outside the bookstore on a Sunday morning in January, not going in, just looking. He thought about trust, what it cost, what it was worth, what it looked like when you built it correctly. Slowly, with the right materials, without compromising the foundation even when it was easier to compromise. He looked at his wife. She was looking at the arch again, that arrested quality, that genuine attention. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "The arch will be there tomorrow," he said. She smiled. The real version, the one that arrived before she decided to allow it. "I know. Tonight I'd like you to look at me." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Thank you. You're very demanding for someone who showed up to our first date with a coffee stain on his collar." "That was strategic," he said. "It was not strategic. It was character development." She laughed, and he felt it against his shoulder, and they kept moving through the music in the imperfect way of people who have decided to keep moving, and the theater held them the way buildings held things, without judgment, without conditions, with the patient endurance of something that had learned through long experience that the people inside were what made it worth standing. Outside, New York was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of everything, all the lives and the noise, and the 10,000 simultaneous stories of a city that didn't slow down for any single one of them. And somewhere in Astoria, in a park on a cold November night, a pigeon with a dark spot on its chest sat on a bench and waited, the way it always did, for the morning. Some things, Lily had said, always knew which way home was. She was 6 years old, and she had not been wrong yet.